For many women in rural parts of Ethiopia, grinding flour is a way of everyday life. You'll see them bent over huge stones, crushing wheat and seeds, often by hand. And sometimes their young children, babies, are there with them. A scene quite possibly like that was thrust into chaos and carnage on Monday when, according to multiple reports, an Ethiopian airstrike struck a mill in one Tigrayan town. Aid workers say at least 17 people, mostly women grinding flour, were killed and dozens were wounded. Another airstrike on Saturday in the town of Dedebit purportedly hit a camp for displaced Ethiopians. It killed 56 people and wounded dozens more, including children. Monday's bombing happened on the very same day that U.S. President Joe Biden spoke with Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and urged him to negotiate a ceasefire. And as he's done many, many times before, Abiy downplayed the crisis, tweeting that, among other things, the two leaders discuss bilateral relations and cooperation. Meantime, aid workers whose lives are also potentially endangered every single time there's some kind of air assault are struggling to treat survivors when the smoke clears. And those aid workers are up against some of the worst challenges, like severe fuel, cash and supplies shortages across the region. Joining me live now is Stefan Dujarric, spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General. Stefan, thank you so much for being with us. I've been to Ethiopia a number of times, but I think for our audience, at least some members of our audience, when you hear about a war happening in a place that you've never been to and, quite frankly, you might never go to, it can be quite difficult to paint a clear picture in your mind as to what's happening on the ground. I think it's important to note that the people of Tigray right now, as I speak, are generally waking up with two concerns in their minds. Number one, when and where the next airstrike might hit, and how, if at all, they're going to eat each day. Just walk us through what people in Tigray are dealing with right now.
Well, what we're seeing now in Tigray is one of the most constrained humanitarian crises in the world. We have over 5 million people, that's 5 million men, women and children, who are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, who need help to get food on the table, to drink, for life's basic necessities. And unfortunately, we're continuing to see fighting, which the Secretary General has called loud and clear in public comments, in private conversations, that we need to see an end to the fighting. As we speak, we're getting reports of fighting in Debele, which is a town, which is a critical town for us in terms of humanitarian access. We don't have the tools that we need to help those more than 5 million people currently. And that is a tragedy for the people of Tigray and for all the people of Ethiopia who need humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, as you talked about, obviously you work for the Secretary General, you work for Antonio Guterres. You talked about the fact that, yes, he's called for both sides to end the fighting. He's also called for the central government to allow humanitarian access into the region. As I've talked about in this program many, many times before, we don't really get a sense that Abiy Ahmed is listening to either the UN or the United States or any kind of other sort of international mediator. The people on the ground in Ethiopia, many of whom are very vocal on Twitter, often say to me that they don't want outside influence. They don't believe that it's anyone else's business what is happening on the ground in their country. How much harder does that make your boss's job?
Look, frankly, these days my boss's job is rather challenging, to put it mildly. But I think, it's not just him. The UN and Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, is working hand in glove with the African Union. He is in constant contact with the former Nigerian president, Obasanjo, with the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, and others who are, and Musa Faki, the head of the African Union, who are critical because we strongly believe regional institutions need to take the lead. And so we're there trying to facilitate and support also what the African Union is doing. So the crisis in Ethiopia is extremely complex. There's a political crisis that we believe Ethiopians need to move together towards a dialogue to find the solution to this political crisis. We saw recently a release of political prisoners. For us, there is an immediate humanitarian crisis. In your introduction, you talked about fuel. We have only, a few thousand gallons of fuel left in Tigray for humanitarian operations. We don't have enough cash in Tigray for the mechanics of humanitarian operations, which means paying the salaries of local humanitarian workers, healthcare workers, fuel for trucks, so the food can be distributed. So these are one of the many layers of challenges that my colleagues who are remaining and staying in Mekele, the capital of Tigray, are facing every day.
I'm looking at the clock right now. It's just gone, I think, about 8:30 in the evening in Tigray as we're talking on this program. And that means that there are a lot of people, millions actually in Tigray, who are likely going to bed hungry. It's one thing not to be able to find food for yourself. It's another thing altogether not to be able to find food for your children. As you talked about, there's a lot of issues with aid entering Tigray, including, as you talked about, not enough fuel, not enough cash, that sort of thing. But on top of that, there's the very real threat of airstrikes that aid workers have to contend with. At this point, do we have any idea when aid agencies run by the UN will be able to resume operations in that part of the country?
There are very heavy discussions going on now in trying to help get better access and more predictable access. We haven't had humanitarian convoys going in the last 4 weeks. We haven't had fuel going in Tigray since basically the beginning of August. So we whatever fuel we can, we try to procure locally, but there isn't enough. And just so people understand, the fact that we don't have fuel, of course, means that we're limited in putting food on trucks to go out and distribute it. But it also means that there's a lot of areas that we haven't even been able to access and where we haven't been able to assess what the humanitarian situation in those areas. So there are a lot of unknown unknowns that we're not able to deal with at this time because of the fighting that's continuing.
Then that means the situation could actually end up being far worse than you and I could possibly even imagine. Stefan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, Suzanne. Thank you for talking about this.